Our next speaker is the oddball in the lineup, an author of Electroboy. He is neither a psychiatrist nor a judge nor what else, Andy, aren't you? A lawyer, okay. He's hilarious. His book is the memoir of mania. So it's actually very serious but funny too. And he's here to tell you about his life with the criminal justice system, should we say, within the criminal justice system. And his book is available on Amazon, I'm supposed to say.
Is this a functioning timer? No. You are the timer. Okay. I have to now raise this again. This Maureen is shorter. I'd like to move this. Thank you. I am not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not an attorney. So people say, then, well, what are you? I say, well, I'm a professional patient. And I think I'm a professional patient because I've really seen it all. I've probably seen 40 mental health care professionals. It's a new word. Professioners. You can use that. But here's my very brief story. And the subject today, I mean, I always mess people up because I'm going to change. I hope it's okay with you, Ellen, and I hope it's okay with you, Chris. But I mean, I'm not going to change it wildly. But my subject is how the criminal justice system failed during my battle with mental illness. And then I'd like to add, and how the legal system continues to fail me because of my mental illness. And I think that's just as interesting. But my basic background is that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder very late, at 29 years old. I probably could have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 6 years old. I guess the crowning moment of my problems with the legal system were when I decided to counterfeit artwork in 1990. I was working for a pretty well-known New York artist. I was his dealer. I had no sense of the consequences because of my illness that what I was doing was wrong at all. I thought it was a good idea. And people say, well, how can you think counterfeiting was a good idea? It's because I didn't consider the consequences. And he had always told me, get as much work out there as possible, sell my work. So I figured if I was making 15% on selling his work, I could make 100% if I counterfeited his work. And he wasn't an artist. His name was Mark Kastabi. He didn't paint his own paintings. He just signed them. And I was also authorized in his absence to sign for him. So it was a very interesting federal case. But I started selling kind of at the rate of 10 to 1. For every one, quote, real painting, I would sell 10 paintings, mostly abroad, in Japan, in Italy. So legitimately, he was making about $3 or $4 million a year, and I was making much more than that. Eventually, I showed up to work one day, and not knowing the consequences and not being very well at all, he called me from Tokyo and said, there are a lot of paintings here, and I don't know if they're mine or if they're not mine, but something's really funny. So I went to work that day, and there was a yellow and black police tape around the building, and I figured probably not the best day to go to work. So I went to my attorney, who said to me, I called him, and he said, just bring $10,000. I said, well, that's easy, because I have about $800,000 in the freezer. And we tried to negotiate my way out of this. I mean, I remember through the negotiation, I had no idea that the person we were talking about who had committed this crime was me. He didn't accept my offer. He said, I'd like to see you on Rikers Island, which was not a pleasant thought. But it took 2 years until I was actually indicted, and then I finally went to trial. It was a fascinating trial. I mean, fascinating in so many respects because, A, I didn't know I was the defendant. I was still not well enough to understand I was the defendant. But I kept thinking, oh my God, this poor guy. I probably was more vigilant than my attorney, who was brilliant, in attempting to support this guy. And I was indicted on 5 counts of wire fraud. It really had nothing to do with counterfeiting work. It had to do with wiring money. So it was all wire fraud. And of course, all these wonderful people in my life, my local bank teller came to testify that, yes, Mr. Behrman did receive $1.5 million, a $1.5 million wire transfer. And when she was finished testifying, I said, thank you so much. I had no idea how to react. But I was only convicted on 1 count of wire fraud, for which I could have gone to prison for 5 years. I ended up serving 5 months in prison, 5 months under house arrest with an ankle bracelet, with a monitor on my ankle, which is why to this day I still don't wear socks. I vowed never to wear socks again because it was so bulky to wear socks. But that was really my major crime. But throughout the illness, there were so many other crimes for which I really feel like the system failed me. And those were basic things like walking into a store and just taking whatever I wanted, and then explaining as just as hard as I could that, well, you don't understand. I own this store. It's not really a big deal. And then the police would come, and they would arrest me, when it was clear that the best place for me was the emergency room, because I either was off medication or just really not well. So I think I was arrested 12 times, and 9 times I was taken to jail. And the same jail every time. I mean, they knew me. And they knew that after I was in jail that I would go right to the emergency room. So I always thought it would be much easier if I just went right to the emergency room. But of course everyone said, well, wouldn't it be easier if you just took your medication? Which is not exactly what you tell somebody who is not med compliant. Well, of course it would be in retrospect. And of course I wish I had. But there was a lot of unnecessary time in prison, or not prison, but in jail being processed, only to be released to end up in an emergency room. So it didn't make that much sense to me. Of course, I take full responsibility for I take full responsibility for all of the incidents, but the federal crime really, and this was 1993, so the discussion of mental illness was not up for discussion. It just didn't come up at all. And when I went back to write Electroboy, I read the jury's notes and Post-its and all these things that went back and forth from the judge. And they said, we think he's a really nice, and the notes were like this, like, he's a nice guy. We don't really know what he did. We don't really think he did anything, but we feel like he may have done something. And this took it was like 3 days of deliberation. And the judge writes back, you have to know that he has committed a crime in order to convict him. So I don't know what they were doing for 3 days. But then they finally settled on 1 count. But I can't say that any of the other 11 arrests were spectacular in any way. Jumping a turnstile in a subway, landed, literally 3 blocks from the same jail it was like it's my club. It was my home away from home. I mean, they knew me. Oh, it's Andy Behrman again. He's in for jumping a turnstile. So I would stay 12 hours, 13 hours, 14 hours, My parents would pick me up. I'd go to Roosevelt Hospital. I'd stay for 2 days, and I'd be put back on my medication. My concern, with the system was that it became extremely frightening to me to be in prison, and B, I realized much later on that it was a complete waste of time. But, there's the issue. What do you do with somebody who's mentally ill, who breaks the law? But these were very small infractions, all of them, except for the big one of counterfeiting. And even that was questionable. And it was questionable in that when paintings were paraded in front of the artist, he said, well, I don't know if that's my painting, and if it is a counterfeit painting, it's a pretty damn good one. So, I mean, the jury had no idea what to think. My concern with people with mental illness, other patients, is that they get stuck in this cycle. And, I know people who, I'm in contact with them now. They're arrested weekly by the same people over and over and over. I mean, it's endless. And it's usually the same issue. I just got a letter from a woman in Atlanta who wrote to me and said, after she had been arrested, she wrote that her boss had left town. She was bipolar. She had been a shoplifter. She had been arrested several times. But the largest scam she had been involved in was when her boss went to London and she depleted his bank account. She just went to the bank with a check, took everything out of the bank, and she was just convicted of fraud. I mean, but this is a woman who was diagnosed very late in life, and she also, as an aside, she wrote to me, I also deal with issues of hypersexuality. She said, I've had to let my former boss know, been having an affair. She was 67 at the time. I've also been having an affair with my boss's 27-year-old sons, twins. So, and she did end up serving time. She ended up serving almost a year, during which she received absolutely no treatment. When I was in prison for 5 months, and I had medication with me, it was given to me when they wanted to give it to me, which I thought was, it was tough. I mean, I still wasn't well enough, to kind of demand that my medication be given to me. But those 5 months in prison, really were of no value. I mean, I should have been in treatment. Perhaps today I could have been in treatment. I don't know. But in 5 months, I was probably set back 5 more years because it took me 9 more years, and I was on disability for those next 9 years, to really get well. And that's when, after 45 medications failed me, I opted for electroconvulsive therapy, and I did make some progress. How are we doing on time? We're doing fine on time. But if anyone has a question along the way, just shout it out. The issue that I wanted to add here is, how the criminal justice system and how the legal system continues to fail me. And I mentioned this anecdote earlier to somebody. It was Alan. On July 3rd, 2 years ago, I was in West Hollywood. I was just finished shopping. I have 2 kids who are 6 and 8 now. And I made a left turn onto Santa Monica Boulevard. There may have been a pedestrian in the crosswalk, but there probably wasn't. I mean, my memory is really pretty good. But I was pulled over, and there were a whole group of policemen waiting outside the West Hollywood police station. And they said to me, have you been drinking? And I'm thinking, I haven't had a drink in about 17 years. But I didn't say that. I said, no, I have not been drinking. And I said, and they said, oh, okay. And then I said, but I do take medication for my bipolar disorder. I said, I take Depakote and I take clonazepam. Well, that was the kiss. That was it. So then I had to get out and take the field sobriety test, which, I mean, I don't know if it's a real test. I don't know what it is. But, of course, I talked through the whole thing and said, look, you're talking, you're nervous, clearly you're intoxicated. I said, no, I'm actually not intoxicated. And then they said to me, how could you do this? I said, do what? I said I didn't drink. I'm willing to take a blood test. And they said, well, we'd rather not give you a blood test because it's a lot easier for us to give you a urine test. I said, fine, I'll give you a urine test. My blood alcohol content was 0. But the strangest thing was that, I mean, I was berated because here I had just gone food shopping, and the policeman looked into the back seat, and he said to me, you did this and you have children. I said, I didn't do anything, except I told you the truth. I took my meds. I did make a left turn. I didn't see what happened. And he said, but, and you also failed the field sobriety test. I don't know if anyone's ever taken a field sobriety test. I don't know if anyone's going to admit it. But it's really hard to pass. I mean, really hard to pass. And when you're nervous, and when you're a nervous person, and when you're bipolar, you're going to be asking all kinds of questions like, what do I do next? How do I do it? And they're like, oh, he's drunk. So I went into the jail, and it was like the same thing again. They took my shoelaces, and I was there for 17 hours, and I looked, there was a sign that said, if you take prescription medication, please let the sheriff know. And I was thinking, why? Should I tell I did that already. But yeah, I did need to get to my medication. So I said, I'm going to need to get to my medication. And they said, well, who would you like to call? And I said, I'd like to call my ex-wife to let her know, because she has my children right now, and she also has access to my home. It was the biggest mistake I ever made. And that leads to the fact that when it came time for a custody battle, which continues and has just lasted a really long time, in this case, I was crystal. My record was impeccable, at least from the point when I was 29, when I was imprisoned. I'm 51 today. I mean, I have 2 kids at a preschool. I'm a room parent. I'm on the parent association. But the one thing that opposing counsel presented was my DUI PD, driving under the influence with prescription drugs. But it was dropped 7 days later. But they kept hammering it home that I was a drunk, and that I was a drunk driver, and that I had 2 children. And it followed me. Worse than that was the fact that I had written a book about my battle with mental illness. So Electroboy became opposing counsel's, because they couldn't find anything else, big issue, which is how can somebody with a mental illness parent? So my attorney said, we've got to fight so that the custody evaluator doesn't read that book, because look what you write about in that book. And she said, it's horrible. I mean, you write about drug use, alcohol abuse, prostitution. You write about your counterfeiting. And I said, it doesn't really matter. You don't get it. Okay? It's not only is it pre-marriage, pre-children, pre-judgment, but and not only is it so old, let the custody evaluator read it. I don't care. And she said, that was fast. 5 minutes, I was just told. And she said, no, I'm going to fight it. And I said, you can fight it all you want, but I'm quite proud of it. I mean, it's years old. It's 22 years old. So opposing counsel won. Custody evaluator was forced to read Electroboy, for which she charged $4,000 to read. You can buy it, and it won't cost you $4,000. But it was the most wonderful. I was, you know, it was it's the best validation I've ever received, which is, you know, it's incredible how Mr. Behrman has come from, you know, point A to point Z. But that black and yellow book, which is a symbol of my mental illness, you know, follows me wherever I go. Wherever I go. I even have I have a T-shirt. Well, I have many T-shirts. Some say bipolar, some say Electroboy, some say no stigma. But there was a woman who was. I have a shared driveway, and someone was dropping off in a carpool, and I was wearing an Electroboy T-shirt, and she was driving about 90 miles an hour in the shared driveway, and I said, "Are you crazy? Could you slow down?" She said, "Let's not talk about crazy." She said, "We all know that you've had electroshock therapy." And I thought, okay, I could definitely be arrested right now based on what I feel like doing. I said, but I'm going to go one step further. So I said, you know, first of all, I'm sorry I called you crazy. Poor choice of words on my part. But you really should slow down. But I'd like to give you a gift. You have a choice. You can have a shirt that says "No Stigma" with Bill Clinton's great slogan about the stigma of mental illness on the back, or you can have a copy of my book. And she said, well, I'll take your book. So maybe I'll try to understand what you're trying to tell me. And that's how that ended. That was was that 20 minutes? Oh, wow. Well, I'm open to questions on anything. Yes.
I need to go to the mic.
Oh, okay. You got a loud voice.
I do.
Yes.
I'm curious about the relationship that you had with your lawyer at the federal case, the wire fraud.
Yes.
Okay. Wire fraud is something the U.S. attorney files when they can't figure out how to prove a real crime.
Right.
It's a throwaway kind of a
Right.
crime. I'm assuming now that you retained this lawyer, that it was not a panel lawyer or a public defender.
My parents second mortgaged their house, yeah.
Okay. Tell me how your lawyer reacted to you, both in terms of preparing the case, getting ready to go to trial and go through all of this, vis-a-vis mental illness.
Right.
And whether or not that lawyer did something that was satisfactory from your perspective about that. Did he get it? Was he trained about it? Did he seem to go for the holes in the law? All crimes, even wire fraud, require a mental element, with rare exceptions, but wire fraud does. Did he seem to resonate to those things? Did he do something with them? Did he go to the U.S. attorney with them? How did he react to all of that and to you vis-a-vis the issue of mental illness with respect to the crime?
Right. I thanks for the question. I mean, the most brief answer is that the discussion of my bipolar disorder never came up until it was time for sentencing. He said, "This is not something I want to address." This is 1993. So it's 20 years ago. Right. It's 20 years ago. So he said, "It's not something I want to address. I'm not going to address it in court." And I do remember saying to him, "Are you aware of how ill I am right now?" And he said, "Yes, but you're highly functional." I said, "But yeah, I'm highly functional at the moment. Like, I don't know what's going to happen later." I mean, quite honestly, most of his issues about my mental illness at that time had to do with my excessive habit of, every Monday, putting together 100 pages of notes for him. That he was more concerned about that. He was like, "Andy, there's just so much I can read." I said, "I know, but you'll find very valuable information in there." How did I pick this lawyer?
This one and not somebody who you could validate as having more sensitivity to these issues?
I mean, you're asking a great question, and I interviewed 6 attorneys, but the issue of my mental illness was poo-pooed by all of them. They said it's not an issue that we're going to bring in front of the court. There's no way we're going to be able to say, well, you know, to the jury, you have to understand that the defendant has bipolar disorder. I mean, we weren't even calling it bipolar disorder then, we were calling it manic depression. He really saved my mental illness for sentencing.
Did you discuss that with him when you retained him or with the other one?
No, we never discussed the fact. Oh, yes, he said he was very clear from the beginning that he thought that my mental illness and bringing up my mental illness would look very weak. But again, this is 20 years ago. He said, but I will save it for sentencing because I think it will be very, very helpful. But I mean, it was not a case where he discussed, you know, the consequence, that the fact that I never thought about the consequences of the crime. We dealt with the facts and only the facts, and the facts were very weak. I mean, the fact that I had, right, it was wire fraud. I mean, the biggest mistake is that I had, you know, people transferring money into my personal account. But I mean, I wish I had a better answer, and I also wish that he had been able to discuss my mental illness, but he was fearful of it. And all 6 attorneys were very clear in saying, this is not something we're going to talk about. Yes.
What do you want to say to the police officers of the world that could accommodate you better? People with mental illnesses when they...
Well, at that, you know, well, you know, I actually thought there was some understanding by the police officer. He actually told me, he said, you know, this is probably not going to end up being a big deal. He said, do you think I could handle this job without taking lorazepam? And I was thinking, please, maybe you'll come to court with me if I end up in court, but I didn't end up in court. He said, you know, he said most DUI PDs are people who are taking Vicodin, you know, are taking really strong painkillers and who are addicted. But they did go to my psychiatrist to say, why did you feel, or why did you never make a note that Mr. Behrman was not capable of operating an automobile? And he said, he's on such little medication. Like, if I thought he couldn't drive, like, I wouldn't allow him to drive. I would make it really clear. But there was some understanding by the police officer. There really was. But in general, I mean, you know, should the police and should the judicial system be better informed about mental illness? Absolutely. I mean, I don't know what the statistic is. There are 500,000 people with mental illness in prisons? Something like that. Yeah, it's a huge number. I'm looking at you like you absolutely have to know the statistic. But it's a huge number. It's 500,000 people. And it's 500,000 people who aren't getting adequate treatment. You know, it's funny because a family who had read my book, their son was an LAPD officer, and he was accused of collecting artillery and bringing it from California to Nevada in the hopes of making so much money that he could buy a condominium in Vegas. And when I called them, I said, well, what's the goal here? I said, could you talk to Rick and like ask him what was going on in his mind, that he was actually selling this artillery and, you know, looking in Vegas, like looking at condos and thinking he was going to come up with $600,000 to buy the condo. So I talked to Rick and he said, first of all, yes, I was talking to other police officers and asking them if they would like start collecting artillery from me. I never sold any, and it was never transported from California to Nevada. And I said, well, you know, I have a more important question for you. have you ever been to Las Vegas? I just had an idea that it was just he said, never been to Las Vegas. So when I was in court, I only was able to speak for about 5 minutes. I said to the judge, who was not happy about my being there, this is about 10 years ago, I said, Your Honor, I only have one question of you, since it's now been proven that no artillery was sold and transported, over state lines. Can you just ask Rick if he's ever been to Nevada, specifically Las Vegas, and if he's ever looked at condominiums? He did, and Rick said, no, but I thought a lot about it. So I don't know what value that has, but I just thought it was fascinating that, nobody was considering that, 100% of this was just a fantasy. Anything else? Yes.
I wonder if you could speed ahead to the future.
Speed ahead to the future.
Or like where you are now.
I wish I could too. Yeah.
I'm a psychiatrist.
Yes.
And I have dedicated my life to both treating and doing research in keeping people mentally healthy and not calling it an illness but keeping them well. You're obviously a little weller now than you were when you were in prison or brought to jail 12 times.
Right.
What allowed you to change? By your perspective.
What allowed me to change? That's a huge question, which requires an extra 20 minutes. But, there's a book there. What allowed me to change was the fact that I was on disability forever. I was under house arrest for way too long. And I thought to myself, I'm a pretty smart guy, kind of cursed with this illness. But my situation was different because, I really felt like I wanted to tell my story. And I wanted to tell my story, and I wanted to share because I hadn't read anything about anybody with mental illness besides K. Redfield Jamison. And, K. Redfield Jamison's bipolar disorder is not my bipolar disorder. I thought, I say to and I used to go to a support group at Mount Sinai Hospital where there were, 14 women who were bipolar and myself. And I thought, Kay Jamison, these 14 women, I have this women's illness. It's called manic depression. I'd love to tell my story because I'm young and there's so many other people who I think have this illness. At the same time that I became ill, a very close friend of mine had a very high-pressure job, and he shot himself in the mouth. But then it started happening all over, and all of these people were bipolar. And I thought, if I could tell my story, and if I could risk my relationship with my parents, who will absolutely hate this book and will not speak to me, then maybe I can be sharing my story, which is not just my story, which is so many people's story with so many people. So that's what I did, and that was the beginning of really getting well. Not because it was, everyone says, well, is it because it was cathartic? Yeah, right, okay, I could have taken a shower too. But the point is, I didn't want to be sick anymore. Being sick is exhausting. It's very tiring. It's tiring not being able to get out of bed. As someone once told me, mental illness is not a casserole illness. When people hear you're mentally ill, they don't say, oh, let me bring you dinner. I could have called people and said, guess what? I have Hodgkin's or I have lymphoma or whatever, and people would have been swarming around me. But instead, if people wouldn't even leave messages on my answering machine. Maureen's moving. Okay, so one more question. And there's about 4 more hours there, but we can talk. Okay, yes.
People say, often you said it today, why don't we just take our medication?
Right.
And, I don't think it's that simple, and I just wondered if you would talk about some of the issues that are part of that, kind of for you or maybe in general.
About people thinking it's just easy to take medication, or, well, I mean, after a while, it is easy to take medication. I mean, even running here this morning, I had everything I needed. And I said, there's one thing I'm forgetting. I didn't take my medication. I mean, it's sitting right there, you know. But it's, if I'm not rushing, it's the first thing I do. If I'm rushing, it's the last thing I do. But when I was ill, I can say, I mean, in my case, I certainly didn't want to take any medication that was going to kind of slow me down or get rid of this mania, which I loved. I mean, I functioned really well, manic 99% of the time, which is why also when I went to, I was diagnosed 8 times with severe depression. I'm not a depressive, but I only presented myself to psychiatrists when I was crashing from mania. So when my doctor heard, because I never shared the stories of it. I mean, I had a psychiatrist who, I mean, I'd give him, you know, at the time when I was really ill and I saw him 3 days a week, and I would give him $750 in cash. He never questioned where the cash was coming from. I thought that would have been a good question, but it was coming from my freezer, and it still was cold. But taking medication, you know, I mean, you know, we're talking about so many years ago. I remember the first time my prescriptions were filled, and I got 6 prescriptions. And I went to the pharmacist, and he came up front, and he said, "Do you have any questions?" And I said, "No." Well, I said, "Yes. Is there anything that I can't take with this medication?" He said, "I'd be careful of over-the-counter medications, cough suppressants, things like that. Just check with me." He said, "But wow, you're really sick." And I thought, wow. It's the same pharmacy, and this is a horrible story, where, I mean, I was so ill and taking so many medications. I remember waiting one day, and I said, "You guys, can I go to the front of the line? I really have to go to the bathroom." No. So I finally said to the woman at the cash register, "I have to go to the bathroom. I'm really sick." And she said, "I'm sorry, we can't let you use the bathroom." And I just stood there, and I went to the bathroom in my pants. And that's how ill I was. But I mean, I was humiliated by my pharmacist. I mean, I was humiliated by everybody, because I was a high-functioning person who needed to get well, just get well. I mean, my own dad was like, you know, how about, you know, what if you start doing like 300 sit-ups a day and doing 300 push-ups, and, you know, I'll coach you through this. You know, forget about the medication. But the sit-ups didn't help. Last question? No? One.
So you're saying that you function differently when you're on medication versus off medication?
Correct. I don't know anymore what it's like to function off medication. No.
So obviously you have found that medication helps you be more functional, or functional in the sense that you can be in the same world as far as you're thinking, more like the rest of the people around you, right? Because it sounds like when you're not on medication, your thought processes are different.
That's true. But on medication, I'm not functioning in the same world as anybody else either. No,
What is different then for you? What is actually the medication doing for you?
it's keeping me stable. It's keeping me from being impulsive, erratic. You know, when I was on antipsychotics, I stopped hallucinating. That was a pleasure. I wasn't being chased down the street by buttons any longer, you know, and that was my big fear, buttons. But no, right, but my thoughts are still the same, but I'm not thinking like, I'm not like anybody else on medication. I don't think medication controls who I am. I mean, even at school, when I say school, I'm talking about a K through 6. I mean, I have to sign all of my emails about parent activities over-enthusiastically yours. I just have more energy than anybody else. It's like we have an auction at school coming up next week. For a year, they've been trying to put together 300 auction items. There are 274 parents. I came up with 75. And someone said to me, "Oh, that's because he's just crazy. I'm not just crazy. I can just move a little bit faster." And I said to everybody, so somebody said, well, why don't you like teach us like how to do this whole auction thing? I said, it's like, it doesn't have anything to do with being mentally ill. It has to do with being smart. Don't go to the dry cleaner and ask for a $25 gift certificate, okay? Go to the Montage Hotel in Beverly Hills, I said, and ask them for a 2-night stay, which is worth $2,500. Just ask. They're going to say yes. Yes, the dry cleaner will say yes to $25, but they'll give you $2,500 too. Anyhow, but I like your question. I like your question very much because it points to the fact that even on medication, I still don't feel. Well, I don't feel like everybody else. So, anyhow, thank you so much.